Welcome to Histier. In this journey, each episode opens the door to a new year as we rediscover the hidden events buried in the dusty pages of history. Our first stop, the year 1770, a year when stories that would profoundly change the future were quietly being written across the world. Mozart, the rise of a child prodigy. In the dim nights of 1770, a rumor whispered through Europe's music halls. People said, "A boy of just 14 is composing a piece that enchants kings." Everyone wanted to believe it, for this boy was no ordinary child. His name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. From the palace halls of Vienna to the narrow streets of Italy, his name echoed everywhere. When he sat at a piano at such a young age, his hands glided across the keys, and the melodies that emerged spoke directly to the hearts of listeners. To them, it felt as if the gates of heaven had opened and the voices of angels had descended to earth. And it was in that very year, Mozart began composing his first great opera. Barely more than a boy, he was already creating a turning point that would change the course of music forever. His notes were not mere black marks on paper. Each was the sound of an emotion, a dream, a whisper. In them, one could hear a mother's tears at times, and at others, the laughter of palace balls. Mozart's music fused the innocence of childhood with the depth of adulthood. That is why his works shook people so profoundly. Among his listeners were nobles, aristocrats, and artists. Some applauded as if bewitched, while others watched the young genius with envious eyes. Yet everyone knew the same truth. That year, a new era in music had begun. At just 14, Mozart was not simply writing an opera, he was leaving behind a legacy etched into humanity's collective memory. His music was the first cry of a voice that would resonate for centuries to come. The Boston Massacre, the first cry of freedom. On a cold March night in 1770, tension had been building in the streets of Boston for days. A silent hatred simmered between British soldiers and American colonists, with murmurs of discontent echoing on every corner. People had grown weary of hearing the footsteps of a foreign army on their own soil. And then that night came. A group of Bostonians gathered in front of the customs house. Stones in their hands, anger on their tongues, they hurled insults at the British soldiers, filling the streets with cries of freedom. The soldiers, their hands trembling from the cold, clutched their muskets. A brief silence, then a shout, and with it, bullets tore through the air. When the smoke cleared, 5 civilians lay lifeless on the ground. This was not merely a clash, it was a spark that would change the course of history. That night, Boston's streets were stained with blood, but also ignited with a people's dream of freedom. Among the dead was Crispus Attucks, a dock worker. His blood would be remembered as the first drop in America's long march toward independence. As the crowd cried out, "The soldiers are killing us!" the British dismissed it as nothing more than a disturbance. Yet the truth was clear to all. This massacre became a wound carved into the heart of a continent. And that wound soon turned into open rebellion. The Boston Massacre was not confined to the deaths of 5 men. It was the first spark of the American Revolution. People no longer felt fear, for blood had been spilled. And where blood flows, the struggle for freedom becomes inevitable. The gunshots that echoed through Boston's cobbled streets that night would, years later, resound across the world as an anthem of independence. Marie Antoinette, from innocence to tragedy. The year 1770 was not only marked by politics, but also by palace intrigues. The Habsburgs, one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, were sending their daughter to France as a bride. When 14-year-old Marie Antoinette set off from Vienna in her gilded carriages, no one knew that one day her name would become the very symbol of tragedy. The young princess was to be wed to King Louis XVI of France. This was not merely a wedding, but a monumental alliance between Austria and France. Yet in the eyes of the people, it was seen as the fate of an innocent girl adorned with a crown. In the streets of Paris, crowds gathered in celebration, with thousands flocking to the squares to greet the new royal couple. But that night of celebration ended not in a fairy tale, but in horror. Panic sparked by fireworks sent the crowds into chaos. Screams filled the streets as people trampled one another. 132 lives were lost, and hundreds were injured. For the people, the wedding was no longer a joy, but a catastrophe. From her very first steps toward France, Marie Antoinette's name became linked to tragedy. As the years passed, the Queen's life overflowed with splendor. The balls of Versailles, music echoing through gilded halls, dazzling gowns that shone like jewels. Marie Antoinette, with her beauty and grace, became the darling of the aristocracy. Her passion for the theater was legendary. Royal plays were staged, and she often appeared at these performances, shining as part of the spectacle. Yet the cost of this grandeur was borne by the poor in the streets of Paris. Bread lines stretched endlessly, and mothers fought to find a crust of bread for their children. While the people starved, the sight of gold flowing in the palace theaters stoked their fury. Rumors spread. The Queen revels on the stage while we die of hunger. And then came the infamous words whispered among the people. If they cannot find bread, let them eat cake. Whether she truly spoke them remains debated to this day. But it no longer mattered because, in the eyes of the people, those words had already become truth. The young princess, once greeted with cries of, "Long live our Queen," had become the very embodiment of extravagance and disconnect. What began in 1770 with innocence would, years later, end in the shadow of revolution and tragedy. Her name was etched into history as the symbol of a story that opened with grandeur but closed in disaster. And history would not remember Marie Antoinette's innocent smile, but her tragic end. The birth of Beethoven. On a cold December night in 1770, in a narrow house in the city of Bonn, Germany, a baby came into the world. Outside, the harsh winds of winter swept through the streets, while inside, the first breath of a new life was heard. No one knew it at that moment. But this small child would one day touch the soul of humanity and compose notes that would transcend ages. His name was Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven was born into an ordinary family. His father, a talented yet heavy-drinking musician, saw a spark of genius in his son and began shaping him with music from a very young age. When little Ludwig's fingers first touched the piano keys, there was a different light in his eyes, a light that foreshadowed a fire destined to burn in the hearts of millions. The year 1770 would be remembered not only for Beethoven's birth, but also for another miracle. That same year in Europe, another prodigy, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, at just 14 years old, had begun composing his first great opera. History, on the very same calendar page, inscribed two towering names side by side, one just being born, the other already rising. Mozart's music was like the clarity of the sky, pure, graceful, and enchanting. Beethoven's music would be like a stormy sea, passionate, rebellious, and overwhelming. Together, they gave humanity both the serenity of the heavens and the might of the tempest. That first cry in December 1770 would one day turn into symphonies. Within those symphonies, one could hear the laughter of triumph and the tears of sorrow. When Beethoven opened his eyes to the world, no one knew that this child would one day transform even silence into music, leaving humanity immortal melodies despite losing his hearing. Thus, 1770 was etched into history. With Mozart's rise and Beethoven's birth, the destiny of music was rewritten within a single year. The rise of the Industrial Revolution. In the 1770 seconds, a new sound began to echo through the streets of England. No longer was it only the hammering of blacksmiths or the bustle of marketplaces. Now it was the hum of factories, the turning of wheels, and the rumble of machines. The world was witnessing one of the greatest transformations in human history, the Industrial Revolution. One of its pioneers was Richard Arkwright. By bringing together spinning machines, he established large factories. What had once been done in the back rooms of homes or in small workshops was now carried out in vast buildings by the labor of hundreds of workers. Water-powered machines turned their iron arms day and night, processing wool, cotton, and flax at a speed never seen before. This was more than a technical innovation. Humanity's way of life was being fundamentally reshaped. Thousands left their villages to migrate to cities in search of work at factory gates. The smoke-filled sky became the symbol of a new era, where once the quiet fields bore the marks of the plow, now chimneys rose into the heavens. At first, aristocrats scoffed at these new factories, believing they would devalue the labor of peasants and artisans. But the sheer productive power of the machines soon overtook the entire economy. Wealth was no longer born of the land, but from the turning gears of factories. Yet this progress came at a heavy price. Children were made to work among the machines. Women toiled at the looms until dawn. While factory owners amassed fortunes, workers struggled with hunger and exhaustion. This injustice would, in time, ignite the sparks of the first workers' uprisings in England. Arkwright's factories were spinning not only thread, but also the very fabric of the modern world. With the 1,770 seconds, misty, smoke-laden cities became the landscape of a new age. Humanity would never again return to its old agrarian society. The Age of Enlightenment, rising ideas. The 1,770 seconds were not only an age of wars, revolutions, and palace intrigues, but also an age of ideas. Across Europe's salons, libraries, and coffeehouses, a new wind was blowing. It rose from the pen, spread across the pages of books, and stirred storms in the minds of the people. Among the pioneers of this age were Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot. They championed freedom, equality, and the power of reason. Voltaire, with his sharp pen, criticized kings and the church, writing boldly against injustice. Rousseau, declaring man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains, questioned the very foundations of society, insisting that the will of the people was greater than that of thrones and nobles. Diderot, through his encyclopedia, gathered human knowledge and proclaimed that knowledge should not belong to the elite alone, but to all. These ideas did not remain confined to paper. They whispered through the opulent salons of aristocrats, echoed in university halls, and spread among ordinary people in the corners of coffeehouses. For the first time, the masses were beginning to recognize their own power. The Enlightenment was a war fought not with swords, but with pens. Its ammunition was ink, its weapon was the word. These rising ideas would, in time, resound in the squares of revolution, as people rose against kings and emperors, remembering that their greatest power lay in their own thoughts. Thus, the 1,770 seconds marked not only a new era in industry and politics, but also in thought. The dream of freedom and equality had become irreversibly woven into the very fabric of society. Little notes: inventions, births, deaths. The year 1770 was an age of great wars, revolutions, and courtly tales. Yet in the shadows of these grand events, smaller moments unfolded, moments that at first glance seemed minor, but whose traces history has never erased. Joseph Priestley's bubbling experiment. In England, a chemist was conducting an unusual experiment in his laboratory. Joseph Priestley tried infusing water with carbon dioxide. What emerged was a drink filled with tiny bubbles, refreshing on the tongue. Yes, 1,770 marked the very first step toward modern carbonated beverages. That day, it was only an experiment. But consider this. From aristocratic salons to village cafes, the bottles of soda people hold in their hands today can be traced back to those sparkling bubbles in Priestley's flask. The birth of Hölderlin. That same year, in a small German home, a baby was born, Friedrich Hölderlin. He would go on to become one of the most powerful voices of Romantic poetry. No one knew it on the day of his birth, but with his pen he would capture love, nature, and the human soul verses that would be remembered centuries later. 1,770 was not just the birth of a poet, but the planting of a seed in the heart of Romanticism, Tiepolo's Farewell. And in Venice that year, the great painter Giovanni Battista Tiepolo drew his last breath. With his brush, he had carried the heavens onto palace ceilings, filling his frescoes with dancing angels and gods. In 1770, as one genius departed, he left behind indelible marks on the history of art. In a single year came births, deaths, and inventions, each so different yet all sharing the same calendar page. Priestley's sparkling bubbles, Hölderlin's poetic breath, and Tiepolo's magnificent canvases ensured that 1,770 would be remembered not only for great revolutions, but also for small yet unforgettable details. The James Somerset case, the first great step against slavery. In 1,770 seconds England, the story of one man grew into a voice powerful enough to change the course of history. That man's name was James Somerset. Somerset had been torn from West Africa and taken to America, then brought to England by his master. Like the thousands carried in chains, he was a slave. But fate would record his name not merely as a slave, but as a symbol of the fight for freedom. In 1772, his master tried to put him back on a ship to be sold in Jamaica, but Somerset resisted. He escaped, was captured, and chained again. Yet this time, he was not alone. Friends and lawyers in London who believed in liberty stood by him, and a case was brought before the English courts. This trial would represent not just the fate of one man, but the dignity of an entire people. In London's coffeehouses, people spoke of the case. Newspapers ran headlines and the streets buzzed with the question, will slavery be outlawed in England? Crowds gathered outside the courtroom, waiting breathlessly for every word spoken inside. After months of debate, Judge Lord Mansfield delivered his decision. The hall fell into silence, breaths were held. With a grave voice, Mansfield declared, "The state of slavery is not recognized by the laws of England. Therefore, James Somerset must be discharged." At that moment, the chains were undone. The guard's cold hands slipped from his wrists. James Somerset stepped slowly into the center of the courtroom. For an instant, the crowd was silent, then cheers and cries of joy erupted outside, shaking the walls. Those small steps marked not only one man's freedom, but the beginning of one of history's greatest movements. Of course, slavery did not vanish overnight. Across the Atlantic, chains still bound the wrists of thousands. Yet the Somerset case struck the first crack in those chains. It gave people hope, and it strengthened the movement. What began in a small courtroom in the early 1770s entered history as one of the greatest strides ever taken in humanity's fight for freedom. Famine and bread shortages in France. In 1770s, France, while the grand halls of the palaces glittered with splendor, the streets told a very different story. Even bread, the most basic necessity of the people, had become a luxury. Years of poor harvests, famine, and drought had dried the soil and left the threshing floors empty. As the fields grew barren, the price of wheat soared. Long lines stretched outside bakeries, where people waited for hours only to find even a dry loaf out of reach. At times, anger erupted. Women and children fought in front of bakeries, and survival belonged to whoever managed to seize the bread. Echoed through the streets of Paris. In the countryside, the misery was even worse. People boiled roots out of desperation while rumors spread from mouth to mouth. The court is hoarding the grain. The nobles are stealing the people's bread. These words were whispers of despair, hardening into fury. Inside Versailles, however, life unfolded in stark contrast. Feasts served on golden plates, dazzling balls, glittering diamonds. While the people starved, the palace tables overflowed with fine wines and exquisite dishes. The gulf between court and commoner widened each day, and the anger in the streets quietly swelled. And the women? It was they who raised one of the most powerful cries in history. Mothers who could no longer feed their children took to the streets, pots and pans in hand, marching through Paris. Shouting, "We want bread!" They stormed the gates of Versailles. It was not only the voice of hunger, but the cry of justice, equality, and rage. From the 1770s onward, famine became a shadow haunting the French people. Mothers wept when they could not feed their children. Fathers lowered their heads in helpless silence. The people no longer wanted bread alone, they wanted accountability. And this quiet fury would, years later, rise behind the barricades as a thunderous cry. Behind the French Revolution's social upheaval lay not only political arguments, but the desperate voices of a people tested by hunger. The first scandal newspapers in England. In 1770s England, it was not only the hum of factories that filled the streets, but also the rustle of paper. Newspapers were beginning to emerge as a new power capable of shaping history. Yet these papers did more than deliver news. They revealed secrets and tore away the masks of the nobility. Publications such as the Morning Chronicle exposed the hidden schemes of politicians and the scandals of aristocrats. Gossip that had once remained locked behind palace doors was now multiplied in printer's ink and placed in the hands of the public in the early hours of the morning. A lord's secret affair, a politician's corruption, or an aristocrat's extravagance, these were no longer whispers passed from mouth to mouth, but written truths for all to see. When people opened their newspapers, they began to glimpse the decay beneath the glittering surface of royal and noble life. The papers drew such attention that people gathered in coffee houses, where one person would read the news aloud as others listened and debated with excitement. A lord's misstep, or a minister's hidden romance, became topics of laughter or outrage, discussed passionately across crowded tables. For the first time, the public had the chance to peer into the lives of the powerful. Naturally, this posed a great threat to the crown and the aristocracy. Nobles sought to sue journalists, negotiating with the monarchy to halt the publications. But it was already too late. The power of the press had begun to unlock the door to freedom. The rise of this scandal press, in 1,770 seconds, England laid the groundwork for modern media in the years to come. As the people's voice grew louder, the rulers bore a heavier burden. No secret could remain hidden forever. James Cook, The Shores of Australia, and Joseph Banks' discoveries. In 1770, the seas swelled not with waves, but with human curiosity. The HMS Endeavour of the British Royal Navy, after months at sea, sailed toward lands unknown. Its captain, James Cook, fixed his eyes on the horizon. Before them stretched a continent no European had ever seen, Australia. On the morning of the 29th of April 1770, when Cook and his crew set foot on Australia's shores, the world's maps were forever changed. Eucalyptus trees swayed in the wind, strange animals roamed the beaches, and unfamiliar plants grew in abundance. It was as if they had landed on another planet. Beside Cook was a young naturalist, Joseph Banks. Notebook in hand, spyglass around his neck, he wandered the coastline, recording every plant he saw and carefully collecting specimens. In just a few weeks of research, hundreds of new plant species were catalogued, flowers of shapes unseen in Europe, curious leaves, exotic scents. Banks's notebook became one of the most valuable records in the history of science. For the crew, the journey was filled with the wonder of the unknown. When they noticed the indigenous people watching from a distance, they were struck with awe. And when they first saw the strange hopping creatures, kangaroos, they looked at one another in astonishment. As Banks's specimens filled the ship's hold, sailors joked, "We'll present these to the Queen when we return to London." And indeed, that is what happened. Upon their return, Banks's exotic collection caused a sensation among London's elite. Nobles competed to glimpse these strange plants, while aristocratic salons buzzed with talk of the wonders of Australia. Exotic flowers and seeds quickly became symbols of prestige in England, but fascination spread beyond the palaces. In coffeehouses, people unfolded newspapers and marveled at Cook's new maps. "There's an animal called a kangaroo out there," someone would exclaim, provoking laughter, while reports of plants from beyond the seas were received with astonishment. Even ordinary people began to realize how vast and mysterious the world truly was. Yet behind these discoveries lay another truth. Every coastline marked on a map was also the precursor to colonization. The footsteps that pressed into the sand that day signaled not only discovery, but also the approaching storm for the indigenous peoples. Cook's landing in Australia and Banks's discoveries were remembered not merely as a scientific triumph. This voyage symbolized the height of the age of exploration, a collision of curiosity, scientific record, and imperial ambition. And so, as a continent was discovered, the destiny of its people was irreversibly altered. We have witnessed the hidden stories that lay in the shadow of 1770. Never forget the lessons history whispers to us. But the journey doesn't end here. Next, we will open the door to 1771. Don't miss it. Make sure to subscribe to the channel.